That's inconsistent with a random drive-by shooting. Random drive-by shooting, people don't stop and wipe prints off a car that they have shot at. The victim's prints should have been on the car, so should have been all of the other emergency people. What did they mean by the fact that processing of the car was negative for prints? My explanation was that they probably meant no workable prints, which is a logical thing. But when I tried to get confirmation of that, we could get no answers to our questions. It kept adding more and more confusion to this case. It was damage to the victim's vehicle that Officer Wallace gives an interview to me in which he said she and Detective Merriman were arguing about the fact that the damage was because the victim struck her head in a car accident. And somewhere along the line, somebody calls for a supervisor at the scene. So 25 minutes, this scene is not considered a crime scene, not protected, not documented. More and more and more questions, and we still, to this day, have no answers to some other questions. For example, the criminalistics unit reconstructs the scene in a way that gets the victim's car up against this pole by following what they say is a trail of glass. We had a diagram where they drew a picture of a trail of glass. When we got the crime scene pictures and looked at the pictures, there was no glass in the picture. No glass was taken into evidence. The criminalistics unit was at the scene only a couple of hours and processed the vehicle. The vehicle was towed away. It was towed with no evidence hold. This becomes controversial because during the course of our investigation, we come across news footage of the Kaitlyn Arquette shooting, showing criminalistics people processing the scene. Thought this was really valuable to our investigation. And then we see in this video daytime video of the Kaitlyn Arquette case in the impound lot. In the daytime photos, the bullet hole in the side of the car has an evidence marker on it. It says I-1, which didn't seem to be unusual to me because in the criminalistics report, they refer to this bullet, Impact 1, as I-1. We went back down to APD to ask for the additional photographs to show these additional evidence markers. The Albuquerque Police Department denied that that marker was theirs, that they never processed the vehicle after it left the crime scene, and implied that I, or people working with me, had placed that I-1 evidence marker on the car. That was unacceptable to me. I tracked down the news video that turned out to be taken by KOB TV. We went down to KOB TV. They gave us access to all of their archives, found the footage, found out who took the footage. The videographer was Carrie Moots, interviewed Carrie Moots, and said absolutely he did not put that I-1 evidence marker there. APD insists that I-1 evidence marker is not theirs. They insist that they did not process this scene further. They insist there are no further photographs of this vehicle. We did some further interviewing, and we find other people who said, yes, a second-day workup was done on the car, which would be totally consistent. It is more consistent that they would do a second-day workup. You can't do everything at a crime scene at night in slight rain. Why they don't want to identify this follow-up is very confusing to me. In these daytime photographs, we see another angle of the car which shows fresh damage to the left rear quarter panel on the side of the car. We went back and looked at the other pictures and went back to look at the criminalistics report, and it said there was damage to the left side and left rear, but it was old damage. We then interviewed the Arquette family and other people who had access to the car. They said that there was no damage to that left rear quarter panel and back on the day of the shooting. When did that damage occur?
I know there was no damage to that part of Kate's car, the bumper and quarter panel, because Kate was over that morning and I was working on my pickup truck out under the big tree in the front yard and passed behind her vehicle multiple times going to the garage to get tools. I would have seen that damage. It was too obvious not to have caught my attention.
We have other people who have looked at it and said that it was consistent with a pit maneuver being done where you strike the vehicle in a way to get it to pull over, which fits the explanation of why the Kaitlyn Arquette vehicle veered to the left and ended up against the pole instead of after her having been shot twice in the head, and the car should have veered to the right. We talked to the medical examiner, called the medical investigator in New Mexico. The medical investigator said that Kaitlyn Arquette, the damage to her brain from the shooting would have incapacitated, that the damage she sustained from the 2 shots to her head and brain would have incapacitated her. She would have been unable to control her car. How did her car get from what Albuquerque Police Department says is 700 feet away from where the shots were fired, where this glass is supposed to have been found in the street? However, there is no evidence of glass. All these questions are still unanswered. The Albuquerque Police Department insists till this day that this case is a random drive-by shooting. Our investigation says that Kaitlyn Arquette was deliberately targeted, and we may have information to indicate some things that caused her to be targeted. When we finally had access to the crime scene photos, it added some more information but raised more questions for me. For example, the absence of blood on the left side of the vehicle when the victim was shot twice in the head and the driver's window is all broken out was interesting to me. The reports also indicate that there's no blood on the front part of the car. All the blood is to the left floor, which is consistent with the medical investigator's observation that when Kaitlyn was shot, she would have immediately fallen over to the right side. The absence of blood on the left side and the damage to the victim's face raised some questions for me as to whether or not the victim could have been shot while her car was up against the pole by someone standing next to her car. There are some indicators that help police and medical professionals make that determination. The problem is the interposed glass changes some things. The damage to the side of Kaitlyn's head obscured what might have been gunpowder, but the medical examiner did indicate to me that it could have been possible that the shots were fired. They all say the shots were fired close. My contention is that the shots were fired. She immediately fell to the right. That's why all the blood is to the right. There's also no blood on the left side of her clothing. Everything went to the right. It seems inconsistent to me that she could have been shot 700 feet away. Her car traveled to hit the pole, and then she fell over. But again, this is another indication of we have no one true fact in this case that we can take as a measuring point. And no one will answer the questions, no one will remove the confusion. Criminalistics responded when finally someone, and there's an argument between Detective Merriman and Officer Wallace, who called a supervisor to the scene. 25 minutes later, a supervisor came to the scene. They classified the scene as a crime scene. Criminalistics and homicide was called. Also interesting to me is that there was no interview with the medic that made the determination of the bullet hole and the impact to the victim's head. It should have been a critical person to be interviewed. There was no interview with that person. In Kaitlyn's vehicle was a note, kind of a map, a kind of a note, which had an address in it and some directions. When the case detective arrived, whose name is Detective Steve Gallegos, he took the note and did what any good investigator would do, took the note and followed the directions and went to the location that turned out to be the last person that we know of that saw Kaitlyn alive. Detective Gallegos followed the map to an address on 19th Street, about a mile and a half down Lomas, would be off the intersection of 19th and Lomas. He interviewed the person named Sharon Smith. Sharon identified herself as a new friend of Kaitlyn's that they met at Fair Plaza. Sharon Smith had a snow cone cart at Fair Plaza. Kaitlyn worked at Pier 1 that was in Fair Plaza, and they developed a friendship. This was supposed to be the first time that Kaitlyn had visited Sharon. Supposedly, Kaitlyn arrived at 9:30. That's the information on Detective Gallegos' report. And she left at approximately 10:45. Sharon Smith tells Detective Gallegos that Kaitlyn was upset because she had had a fight with her boyfriend, whose name is Dung or Yun Nguyen, a Vietnamese young man that was living with Kaitlyn in her apartment. Kaitlyn was upset over the fight. She wanted to avoid Dung. She wanted to try to find out where Dung was so that she could avoid him. And according to Sharon Smith, Kaitlyn was using the phone repeatedly during the time she was there to keep ringing the apartment, and there was no answer at the apartment. There was some discussion about whether or not Kaitlyn would stay the night. Kaitlyn decided, Sharon says abruptly, to leave and said she was going home to her mother's home, got in her car and left. She would have traveled eastbound on Lomas. Sharon provided some information to Dung Nguyen, the boyfriend, to Detective Gallegos. She indicated his work telephone number and where Kaitlyn and Dung had lived. After Detective Gallegos finished talking with Sharon Smith, he and another detective drove to Kaitlyn's apartment. The address is 303 Alvarado. They arrived about 3 in the morning and supposedly woke up Dung Nguyen, the boyfriend. He claimed he did not know where Kaitlyn was. He said that he had been home since 10 o'clock, which would be inconsistent with what Sharon Smith had said about the fact that Kaitlyn had been calling every couple of minutes between 9:30 and 10:45. They did a primer residue test on Dung, which was clean, and while there, he did admit that they had had an argument, but that said that everything was all right. While at the apartment, they found a note that was placed into evidence. The note was said to have been written by Kaitlyn to Dung. Started out with Hun, and it seemed like it ended up that everything was all right. That note is still booked into evidence as having written by Kaitlyn.